Fox News Alert as we continue to watch the developments in the courtroom of the George Zimmerman murder trial in Sanford, Florida. That's one of the defense attorneys doing a cross-examination right now of the medical examiner, the doctor who performed the autopsy on the body of Trayvon Martin. He testified within the last hour or so that Trayvon Martin suffered, in his opinion, that he was in pain and that he lived for between 1 to 10 minutes after the time he was shot. There's some discrepancy right now as to how long the body remained at the crime scene before it was brought to the office of the medical examiner. We're going to keep our eye and our ear on the testimony that's going on right now, but we also want to analyze some of the testimony that's already taken place today. This, what is expected to be the last day for the prosecution. We do think, and we've been led to believe, the prosecution will rest its case before the end of the day today, and then the defense will take over as we see the defendant there sitting in the courtroom. Joining us now, Dan Schorr, Marla Chikotsky. Thank you both for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having us.
And as we take a look at this testimony, we'll continue to keep an eye on it. But Dan, give me your take first of all on the medical examiner, sort of what he does for either the prosecution or for the defense.
Well, first of all, in any murder prosecution, you usually call the medical examiner just to establish how the person died, and you go clinically through it, what injuries there were, what was the cause of death, and that's not only legally important, but also emotionally important, because it makes the victim here, the deceased person, a real person. We really hear about how they suffered in this case, and that brings home the emotional component that the prosecution wants the jury to hear about also, in addition to the details of how he died.
So at the same time, though, Marla, this is not a witness who can testify at all to any information about the confrontation that led up to the shooting. He's not able to really help the prosecution make the case that that George Zimmerman shot without provocation.
Yes, absolutely, Rick. You're 100% right about that. What I find interesting is that Judge Nelson allowed the testimony to go in about Trayvon Martin suffering from 1 minute to 10 minutes, because that really is not relevant in this matter, whether it proves or disproves who the aggressor was, if George Zimmerman shot him in self-defense. So the fact that Trayvon Martin was suffering is only prejudicial and appeals to the sympathetic needs of the jurors in this case. And so I find it very troubling that medical examiner got to testify about that in this case.
Okay, earlier today, perhaps the most emotional testimony yet, Trayvon Martin's mother taking the stand, and her testimony crucial for the prosecution as they try to make the case that it was in fact Trayvon Martin's voice crying for help that is heard on some of the 911 calls that were made. They played that tape for her, and they asked her whose voice she heard. Let's take a look at that from earlier today.
If it was your son, in fact, screaming, as you testified, that would suggest that it was Mr. Zimmerman's fault that led to his death, correct?
Correct.
And if it was not your son screaming, if it was, in fact, George Zimmerman, then you would have to accept the probability that it was Trayvon Martin who caused his own death, correct?
I don't understand your question.
Okay. If you were to listen to that tape and not hear your son's voice, that would mean that it would have been George Zimmerman's voice, correct?
And not hear my son screaming? Correct. Is that what you're asking?
Yes, ma'am.
I heard my son screaming.
Trayvon Martin's mother being cross-examined by Mark O'Mara, one of the defense attorneys. And Dan, as you take a look and listen to that exchange there, she had already said that it was her son's voice that she heard on the 911 tape when she was asked that question by the prosecutors. Then the defense took their turn, and we were talking earlier, you said sometimes less is more. Did Mark O'Mara sort of overstep some boundaries there in his line of questioning?
Yeah, no matter what your view is of this case, it's emotionally powerful when you hear the mother of Trayvon Martin testifying about hearing her son's voice screaming for help right before he dies. And the defense attorney here is asking her about her opinion, what would happen if the voice was really George Zimmerman's? Would that mean that her son was really at fault? It's really callous, it's inappropriate, and the defense can argue these points on closing without questioning the mother. Sometimes as a cross-examination lawyer, you need to first know what to ask, but you also need to know when to sit down, when to not ask questions, and when to just say, no, thank you, I don't have any further questions or any questions at all.
Marla, your take on that exchange between the defense and Trayvon Martin's mom?
I agree with Dan. I think that when you have a victim or you have someone that's related to the victim, you don't want them to be on the stand for a very long time, because it does leave room for things such as emotions and that exchange between the two where he didn't know the answer to happen. So it can actually weaken the defense's position when you leave someone on and you ask questions that you don't know the answers to. So I think that in this case, less would have been more, and you don't want to inflame the jurors' passions. So for him to cross-examine her and ask her open-ended questions was not necessarily the best idea.
Dan, we have every reason to believe that this could be the last witness that the prosecution is going to call. If they end with the medical examiner, give us your sense of how they've done presenting the case against George Zimmerman.
Well, today they've had a very powerful day, especially in the emotional sense of the word, emotional sense of the case, because the mother's powerful, the medical examiner testifying about how Trayvon Martin died, the fact that he suffered before he died. But none of this really went to the confrontation in the sense that you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that George Zimmerman did not act in justifiable self-defense. And that's their burden here. Whether they have done that is really in doubt at this point.
Marla, I'll give you the last word here as we get set to hear from the defense. What do you expect? What is the point that the prosecution has made that they most have to disprove, or at least to create some doubt for the jury?
Well, I think this case is ridden full of reasonable doubt. I don't think the defense has to do much. The state has the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. I don't think they've met that burden in this case. I think there is a lot of emotions. I think it's unfortunate what happened, but there is a legal burden. There's affirmative defenses, and George Zimmerman has an affirmative defense in this case, which is justifiable use of deadly force. And I think that the state failed to tie up those loose ends and to make it where there is not any reasonable doubt in this case.
Marla Chikotsky, Dan Schorr, thank you both so much. We'll be back with our legal panel and more from the Zimmerman trial when we come right back.